A while back, I listened to this episode of 99% Invisible, and it left an impression on me and is currently influencing what I'm thinking about, what I'm doing down here. Um, Basically, the episode was about ballparks and kind of like the history of the design of ballparks. And what I learned from this episode was that there's rules as far as the distance between the plates, but there's not really rules as far as like how big the outfield needs to be. And so you might have various ballparks that have like different distances. So, it might be easier to hit a home run in one location versus another, or you might need to think about where you're hitting the ball to get a home run, let's say. And so this episode talked about the history of the changes of ballparks, because it used to be there were a lot of different ballparks that were very specific and distinctive and kind of affected by the limitations of their environment. Like if you had a river running by one side, it might constrain how far the outfield is going to be on that side. And it made it have more specific character. And people kind of loved their own particular ballpark. But then they started designing these like multi-purpose stadiums that were supposed to serve football and baseball and various other things. And what it ended up doing is like trying to cover too much and not doing any of it very well. And you would have like a stadium just like floating in the center of a giant expanse of a parking lot, and they had no character, and people didn't want to go to these ballparks. They didn't have a specific distinctive identity. They were just like these floating spaces. So what's interesting to me is that these perceived limitations, you could see it as a disadvantage that, like, let's say there's something constraining the proportions of the building. But those perceived limitations led to a result that's more specific and distinctive and has its own character. And, like our personality is dictated by our limitations. And so that's affecting what I'm doing down here right now. Like I'm intentionally putting myself within a specific environment, a time and place, and with also social conditions, people just walking by behind me, and they sometimes just stop and talk to me. And so that dialogue that happens affects how I do things, how I think about things. There are physical constraints, like as you can see behind me, I'm at the max height of what I can fit within the space between the foliage of the trees. So that has limitations. And then I'm working on a substrate that's very specific and particular to my needs. I'm not working on canvas. I worked really hard to find substrates that would have a certain level of rigidity, but also be flex enough for me to still roll up and set up every day. And there's been all these different problems I've had to figure out along the way for this environment. And I have a painting studio in Greenpoint. I could be there, but that's kind of like one of those stadiums in a way. Like when you're in the studio, you're isolated and you're kind of in a vacuum. And I'm not, basically my takeaway from that episode of 99% Invisible was that it's not beneficial to be creating in a vacuum. The particular environment and constraints, limitations that you're dealing with create your unique character. And that's one thing that I think most artists need to think about, especially today. You have so much competition, so much creativity out there, and you need to think about why is what I do distinctive, and how is it distinctive? And there are a number of ways that can be done. One of the ways that I like to think about is, embracing my context, embracing my limitations, because oftentimes the perceived limitations are not in fact limitations.